The Committee on the Indo-Pacific of the Foreign Affairs Committee will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to help shape how Congress should be thinking about the strategic importance of the Pacific Islands. With that, I would like to recognize myself for an opening statement. You know, I'm really excited that this is my first hearing as a chair of this Indo-Pacific Subcommittee. Yay. Thank you. And also the first subcommittee hearing in this Congress. And I look forward to working with Ranking Member Bera, who's been sitting in this chair when you guys were in the majority, and now we take the gavel and we are in the majority. I look forward to working with both members of both sides of the aisle on policies that strengthen American leadership in the Indo-Pacific. This hearing will examine renewed U.S. engagement in the Pacific Islands and assess the importance of the Pacific Islands. The Pacific Islands, which have long been a linchpin of the United States foreign policy in the Eastern Hemisphere, face unique security, environmental, and economic challenges. They face an increasing number of natural disasters, and some islands have challenges mitigating the environmental cleanup from the U.S. nuclear testing during the Cold War. Many of the islands' economies are critically reliant on tourism and were devastated by COVID-19. Their road to economic recovery is a very long one, and many of their ambassadors have expressed their concerns that the Pacific Islands will never recover. As someone who spent much of my time, my childhood, on that island of Guam, I'm very familiar with these challenges, and I'm committed to ensuring that the U.S. Pacific Islands diplomatic and economic relationship remain a priority for our committee's agenda. The timing of this hearing is critical. The U.S. is currently in negotiations with the Federated States of Micronesia, or FSM, Palau, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, or RMI, to renew the compacts of free association known as COFA. This provides economic assistance, certain federal benefits for their citizens, and allow the U.S. to maintain a military presence in those countries. The compacts with the FSM and RMI are set to expire this year, and the compact with Palau will expire next year. So much of today's hearing will be focused on getting updates on the compact negotiations from the State Department and other agencies involved. I'm concerned that we have not received much information on the status of the negotiations, and going forward, I ask that the State Department regularly update our committee on your progress. I cannot understate the importance of renewing the COFA agreements. Our military installations in these countries are vital logistics hubs for our operations in the Pacific, and the agreements provide the citizens of these countries with benefits that they otherwise would not have. During the Second World War, most of the Pacific faced a brutal Japanese occupation. And the U.S. fought a bloody campaign to liberate the Pacific Islands, and tens of thousands of U.S. service members lost their lives on those islands that today the U.S. has COFA agreements with. 7 years later, the Pacific Islands are facing a variety of new threats. We were recently alarmed by the outgoing FSM president's detailed accounts of the PRC's political warfare, including the dispatch of the People's Liberation Army surveillance vessels in Micronesian territorial waters and the CCP's overt efforts to bribe high-ranking government officials. He went as far as saying, quote, "What else do you call it when an elected official is given an envelope filled with money after a meal at the PRC embassy or after an inauguration?" End quote. Last year, the U.S. and its allies in the region were shocked by the announcement of an ambiguous security agreement between the CCP and the Solomon Islands, which is roughly 20 pages long and would guarantee that the People's Liberation Army could send troops to the Solomon Islands to, quote, "protect the safety of the Chinese personnel and major projects," end quote. The FSM President's letter and the Solomon Islands security agreement with the PRC should be treated as a wake-up call for the U.S. and its allies. The Pacific Islands cannot tackle these challenges alone, and the U.S. strategic interests in the region are too great to let the CCP coerce our friends in the Indo-Pacific into sacrificing their sovereignty and becoming rubber stamps for the CCP's demands. This committee stands ready to work with the administration to ensure that our interests in the Pacific Islands are protected and that our allies and friends in the Pacific Islands have the tools they need to tackle the new security, economic, and environmental challenges they face. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and the members of this subcommittee. With that, I would like to now recognize Ranking Member, the gentleman from California, Mr. Army Berra, for any statements that you may have.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'm particularly delighted. Obviously, the chairwoman and I have a great working relationship, and the fact that she's chosen this topic as her initial hearing, demonstrates the bipartisan support and the importance of the relationship with the Pacific Island nations. When I had the privilege of being chairman, certainly we dedicated a hearing to that importance as well, and I know Mr. Sherman did the same. So this is not a partisan issue. And I think we often forget that we are a Pacific Island nation as well, the United States, and we are in brotherhood and sisterhood with the Pacific Island nations. So it's incredibly important. This is one of the most diverse regions in the world. The Pacific Islands span roughly 15% of the Earth's surface, and are vibrant cultures. And in my home state of California, there are vibrant diasporas as well. I want to appreciate and congratulate Ambassador Yoon and his team, as well as the governments of the freely associated states, for signing MOUs earlier this year and reaffirming our partnership that benefits our peoples and the entire Pacific region. I also, earlier this morning, we had a chance to interact about the administration's budget with Secretary Blinken, and I pointed out that the FY24 presidential budget requests $7.1 billion in mandatory funds over 20 years to support the Compact of Free Association with the freely associated states. It's now up to Congress, and specifically the House Foreign Affairs Committee, to pass authorizing legislation to provide these mandatory funds. This is incredibly important, and by making these funds mandatory, it really does signal a long-term commitment to the region. And I hope we do our work on the committee and the House as a whole to provide these funds. I also think it's incredibly important to recognize the urgent challenges that the region faces. And there's no better way to articulate those challenges than using the voice of folks in the region. And with that, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an op-ed by Tuvalu Prime Minister Natano that was published in Time Magazine in September of 2020.
Without objection.
It really does capture the urgency of climate change. If you look at the people that live in the region and the proximity that they live towards the coast, rising sea level is not just something esoteric. It is a essential threat to their livelihood and existence, and there's an urgency for us to address this. In addition, this is not a bipartisan issue. I was honored to co-sponsor legislation with the late Representative Don Young in the last Congress, the Honoring Oceania Act, to elevate the Pacific Islands in U.S. foreign policy making by delivering a more robust diplomatic and development commitment to the region. I also was honored to be an original co-sponsor of Representative Ed Case's Blue Pacific Act. Together, these two pieces of legislation would expand U.S. economic, development, security, and people-to-people engagement with the Pacific Islands. And I look forward to their reintroduction in this Congress. With that, Madam Chairwoman, I look forward to working with you on this, look forward to making sure we continue to elevate the importance of our relationship with the Pacific Islands and making sure that we're providing the firm financial commitment, the firm security commitments for the long haul. So with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Berra. And I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Hawaii, who I recognize over there by the door, Mr. Case, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing. Absolutely. Without objection, so ordered. Please join us. and other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. And today, we're very pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us on this very important topic. First, Ms. Jane Buckledge is the Deputy and Senior Advisor to the Special Presidential Envoy for Compact Negotiations at the Department of State. Thank you for joining us. And Mr. Craig Hart is USAID Deputy Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for Asia. Thank you for joining us. And Ms. Holly Haverstick is the Director of the International Affairs and Foreign Policy Advisor of the U.S. Coast Guard. Thank you for being with us. Mr. Keon Nakoa is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Insular and International Affairs at the Department of the Interior. Thank you for being with us. Now, I want to thank you for being here today. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for member questions. And let me first recognize Ms. Buckledge for your opening statement.
Thank you very much. Chairwoman Kim, Ranking Member Bera, distinguished members of the House Foreign Affairs Indo-Pacific Subcommittee, thank you so much for this opportunity to testify before you today. I'm grateful for the bipartisan approach of this subcommittee regarding the Compacts of Free Association with the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau, collectively known as the Freely Associated States, or the FAS. The Pacific Islands are globally and strategically important, and the United States must continue to support their security, stability, and prosperity. The U.S. Pacific Partnership Strategy, launched in 2022 as an addendum to our Indo-Pacific strategy, elevates the Pacific Islands within U.S. foreign policy. It describes U.S. plans to address unique opportunities and challenges the Pacific Islands face, and outlines how we build capacity to fulfill and increase U.S. commitments in the Pacific, collaborate with allies and partners to elevate the Pacific in the regional architecture, and empower Pacific Islands to prosper and build resilience to 21st century challenges. The United States shares an especially close relationship with the Freely Associated States. Our relationships with the FAS allow the United States to guard our long-term strategic and defense interests in the region. Finalizing the next iteration of U.S. assistance to the FAS under the compacts is key to maintaining the stability and prosperity of our closest Pacific Island neighbors and partners, and demonstrating to the rest of the Pacific that the United States is here to stay. Our strategic competitors are well aware that the scheduled end of U.S. economic assistance is fast approaching. Now is not the time to leave the FAS open to predatory and coercive behavior. We cannot take for granted goodwill generated from our historic bonds of friendship at a time of increasing competition with the PRC. We have signed memorandum of understanding with each of the FAS that reflect our shared understanding of the levels and types of future U.S. assistance for each country that we intend to request. The Compact team is now focused on continuing our productive talks with each country to negotiate the final agreement texts. Our negotiating team continues to work diligently and in close cooperation with the National Security Council and other interagency stakeholders to facilitate progress on these complex negotiations. To that end, the President's fiscal year 2024 budget request includes $7.1 billion over 20 years to amend and extend the economic provisions of the compacts and their associated agreements. This total includes $6.5 billion in direct economic assistance and $634 million for the unfunded costs of extending the U.S. Postal Services in the FAS. In a few months, the administration expects to submit a full proposal for implementing legislation upon completion of the negotiations. This proposal will include authorization and mandatory appropriations to fund the costs of future additional compact assistance for the expected 20-year period. We look forward to continuing to consult with Congress as the compact-related negotiations progress and conclude. Successful negotiations are crucial to deepening our strategic partnerships in support of a free, open, and secure Indo-Pacific. We appreciate your continued support for these ongoing negotiations and welcome the opportunity to work with Congress, especially this subcommittee, to secure long-term U.S. strategic impact in this vital region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bucklish. I now recognize Mr. Har for your opening statement.
Thank you very much. Chairwoman Kim, Ranking Member Bera, distinguished subcommittee members, thank you very much for allowing me to testify today regarding the strategic importance of the Pacific Islands and how USAID is deepening our engagement in this area. The Pacific Islands, as you have noted, face numerous challenges, increasingly intense environmental changes and climate shocks, distance and disconnection from major markets, and decline in tourism due to COVID-19. They are also navigating the geopolitical and geoeconomic challenges posed by the People's Republic of China, which is capitalizing on instability and natural disasters in this vulnerable region. USAID seeks to partner with the Pacific Island countries with a development model rooted in economic, trade, and integration, and inclusivity, locally led solutions, and democratic values. When I traveled to Palau, Fiji, the PNG, as well as Solomon Islands this past April, it was an eye-opener for me. And Pacific Island leaders really stressed the importance of being present. That is exactly what USAID is focused on now. We are focused on bolstering our existing presence, including reestablishing our USAID Pacific Islands mission in Fiji, as well as elevating the presence of our office in Papua New Guinea to a country representative office. And we anticipate both of these to be in place by September. At this time, the PRC government is assertively seeking to expand its influence. This elevation of USAID presence in the Pacific Islands is critical to ensuring that the United States remains the partner of choice for the region. So under COFA, USAID's involvement supports Article 10, Enhanced Disaster Assistance. USAID has played a heightened role in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, as well as the Federated States of Micronesia, and we both respond in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, as well as help with the long-term recovery, including reconstruction. So for example, in response to Typhoon Wudup, which devastated 30 communities in FSM in 2019, USAID provided more than $7 million in funding to address disaster relief needs, as well as nearly $23 million to assist with reconstruction of damaged homes and public infrastructure. Since 2021, USAID and FEMA have been closely coordinating with the Department of State's COFA negotiation team, working to improve the language in Article 10 to ensure that disaster relief and recovery assistance are both more effective and more flexible. USAID works with the Pacific Islands and fellow donors, importantly, to identify areas of focus which include climate, sustainable fisheries, good governance, economic growth, health systems and strengthening, and the COVID response as well. So in Papua New Guinea, for instance, USAID's collaborating with Australia, Japan, and New Zealand to expand access to renewable energy. We're also protecting the environment, addressing HIV/AIDS, and promoting peace and stability. In Palau, USAID partnered with Australia and Japan to support the development of an undersea cable spur that will increase internet bandwidth and spark economic growth. Similarly, USAID is providing technical assistance to the East Micronesia Cable Project, which will connect the people of Kiribati, Nauru, and Micronesia to faster, higher quality, and more reliable internet. At last week's East Micronesia Cable's executive board meeting, USAID represented the U.S. government as senior representatives from Australia, Japan, FSM, Kiribati, and Nauru met to advance key milestones, including signing donor grant agreements and finalizing the vendor contract. During the Pacific Island Conference of Leaders this past September, I heard leaders very clearly also underscore the importance of ensuring that climate financing is solving real challenges on the ground, and that is exactly where we are focused. Our Climate Ready program since 2016 has been able to do just that, mobilize more than $500 million from climate finance institutions for Pacific Island countries. And just this week in Vanuatu, USAID Assistant Administrator Michael Schiffer announced that USAID has allocated $3.2 million in humanitarian assistance in the wake of tropical cyclones Judy and Kevin, which made landfall over Vanuatu between February 28th and March 4th. So this assistance will provide shelter as well as looking at how we can go about working with communities to provide the rebuilding of homes. It'll also provide the agricultural support, safe drinking water, and supplies and protections that those communities need. So while USAID definitely remains one of the largest donors in the Pacific, we continue to work with our partners very closely. And I thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and also look forward to your counsel and questions.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. I now recognize Ms. Haverstick for your opening statement.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairwoman and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to be here before you today to discuss the Coast Guard's enduring efforts to promote a free, open, and resilient Indo-Pacific in support of the United States Indo-Pacific strategy. The Coast Guard is a multi-mission maritime service responsible for safety, security, and stewardship of waters and vessels subject to jurisdiction of the United States. At all times, a branch of the armed forces, a law enforcement agency, and a regulatory agency, the Coast Guard operates on all 7 continents and throughout the homeland, serving a nation whose economic prosperity and national security are inextricably linked to a vast maritime interests. The Coast Guard protects, defends, regulates, and safeguards the world's largest exclusive economic zone, encompassing 4.5 million square miles of oceans, which include 1.3 million square miles within the Indo-Pacific. A strong global maritime governance includes both defense and law enforcement missions, and is closely connected with the capabilities, actions, and intentions of other nations far from our shores on the high seas and within the waters of our partners. This is especially true in the Indo-Pacific. Coast Guard missions focus on issues that directly support and advance our regional partners' efforts to protect fish stocks, ensure safety at life at sea, and support environmental response, and in addition, provide disaster relief. The Coast Guard has operated in the Indo-Pacific for over 150 years, an enduring role that complements Department of Defense missions. The service's unique authorities and capabilities bridge gaps and create opportunities to enhance partner nation capacity while ensuring prosperity for our nation. We are also able to leverage our environmental response and disaster relief expertise to help nations prepare for climate change, a critical concern for the region. The Coast Guard is focused on 3 lines of effort in the Indo-Pacific: promoting maritime governance, establishing persistent U.S. presence, and conducting meaningful engagements in the region. To accomplish these goals, the Coast Guard employs a modest expeditionary footprint and closely partners with Departments of State and Defense. Around the globe, the Coast Guard operations protect our maritime borders and sovereignty and strengthen partner nations' ability to protect their own sovereign rights and support a rules-based international order. The Coast Guard regional activities bolster partner operational capabilities and strengthen legal foundations that underpin many of the multilateral regional coordinating mechanisms among the Pacific Islands nations for fisheries management, search and rescue, and law enforcement. These important activities promote the free and open Indo-Pacific at a time when the region is experiencing increased coercive activities, including illegal overfishing, transnational organized crime, and corruption, which result in adverse impact on indigenous economies, governance, and survivability. The Coast Guard values strong partnerships with the Pacific Island nations. The service works together with each nation to help assess their needs and develop tailored strategies, avoiding a one-size-fits-all approach to the engagement. Coast Guard also works closely with regional allies, such as Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, to provide both joint and complementary training. This establishes strong foundations on which to build lasting relationships, solidifying the United States as a trusted partner. The result of the service's positive global engagements is demonstrated through more than 60 multi- and bilateral agreements, 11 of which are in the Pacific Island states. These agreements establish the framework for mutual cooperation and allow us, alongside our partners, to address widespread geostrategic issues affecting both our partners and U.S. national security. Our activities and uniqueness allow the Coast Guard to successfully operate in the space between Department of State's diplomacy and the Department of Defense's lethality. The service is well-positioned, working with partners to establish capabilities, presence, and maritime governance. These strong international efforts promote peace, security, and prosperity within the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today and for the continued support of your Coast Guard. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Haverstick. I'm sorry. I now recognize Mr. Nakoa for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Kim, Ranking Member Bera, distinguished members of the Subcommittee on the Indo-Pacific. Thank you for convening this hearing on the U.S. engagement of the Indo-Pacific on the Pacific today. A warm aloha to Congressman Case and talofa to Congressman Radewagen. The Department of the Interior welcomes this opportunity to update Congress on how we carry out our responsibilities in the Pacific Islands, strategically vital homelands, which include Hawaii, Guam, the CNMI, and American Samoa. As the ranking member said, the U.S. is a Pacific nation. From 1951 to 1986, the Interior was also a lead federal agency administering a UN trusteeship for the islands now comprising the nations of Palau, FSM, and RMI, collectively the Freely Associated States, or FAS. In approving the compacts, Congress gave the Secretaries of the Interior and State shared responsibility to implement the agreements. For the past 35 years, the compacts have been a foreign policy, national security, and people-to-people success story. While FAS economies have not fully realized all economic development goals, COFA programs have sustained a stable standard of living, and FAS citizens have contributed significantly to our fabric of our country. According to GAO, in 2018, an estimated 94,000 FAS individuals were living in the U.S. in nearly every state and territory, with an estimated 25,000 in Hawaii, 6,000 in Arkansas, 4,000 in California, and 2,000 in Missouri. Further, roughly half of the FAS population in the United States are also now U.S. citizens. And I note for the committee that FAS citizens proudly serve in the U.S. military at high per capita rates, and they live, work, and pay taxes in our communities. In this context, I am happy to share with this subcommittee that Assistant Secretary of the Interior, Carmen Cantor, just signed letters confirming the administration's support for the Bipartisan Compact Impact Fairness Act, CIFA, which restores access to inadvertently removed federal public benefits for persons lawfully living in the United States pursuant to the compacts. As illustrated today, our strong continuing relationships with the FAS support U.S. interests across the larger Indo-Pacific region. And if passed, CIFA would help alleviate the costs being borne by our states and our territories and strengthen our relationships with the FAS. Moreover, the compacts and amendments being negotiated will confirm the U.S. commitment to our COFA partners, quote, one of the cornerstones of the U.S. Pacific cooperation for nearly 4 decades. And that is why the U.S. Pacific Islands Summit declaration placed the highest priority on the completion of COFA negotiations and recognized that new resources must be included. I have been a member of the U.S. Interagency COFA negotiating team since my appointment in 2021. Our team was strengthened in 2022 under the new leadership of Special Presidential Envoy Joe Yun and Assistant Secretary Cantor. The substantial progress made in the last year culminated in the MOU signed earlier this year, and we strive to complete negotiations as soon as possible so we can propose implementing legislation to include mandatory appropriations to fund most compact assistance for the expected 20-year period. Swift congressional action will be imperative to support the shared interests of the U.S. and our friends in the Pacific, who are under more pressure now than at any time since World War II. As Chair Kim mentioned in her opening, official filings and reports by U.S. and FAS authorities assert bullying and surreptitious political influence tactics are being used in the Pacific today. While some may be concerned that U.S. is expending too many resources for COFA, others emphasize the U.S. cannot afford to abandon these special relationships. The DoD recognizes the compacts are essential for maintaining combat credible presence and represent the Indo-Pacific Command's highest diplomatic priority. We seek strong agreements that reverse any misperception of U.S. disengagement in the region, to include assistance for education, health, and infrastructure, and the continuation of federal programs and services that pre-exist COFA by 35 years. As confirmed in the U.S. Pacific Islands Summit Declaration, we too acknowledge the nuclear legacy of the Cold War, and the U.S. remains committed to addressing the RMI's ongoing environmental, public health concerns, and other welfare concerns. Now is the time to send a clear signal across the Pacific that the compacts truly are a cornerstone of U.S. national interests in the Pacific. We look forward to working with Congress to secure a bipartisan success that solidifies the U.S.'s commitment to the Pacific and to remain the preferred partner for our friends and cousins in the Pacific Islands. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nagoa. Nagoa, I'm sorry, I'm butchering everybody's name today. Sorry. As we begin our line of questioning, I will first recognize myself for 5 minutes. The question will be to both Ms. Buckledge and Mr. Hart. The COFAs expired this year, as you know, but what has the administration done to ensure a timely negotiation of the agreements? And when can Congress expect to receive the final negotiated text?
Thank you. We are working very, very hard with all 3 countries to complete the final negotiations. We are aiming for weeks, not months, but we are working with 3 countries that, of course, have their own internal political processes, their own bureaucratic reviews of documents, and so forth. There are 10 separate agreements, all the various subsidiary pieces that have to be put into place across the 3 countries. And so it is a complex, multi-layered effort, but we have the full support of the White House, and our interagency partners have been fantastic, responsive, and we're all very eager to make progress and are very hopeful that we will get there as soon as possible. We do recognize that Congress does need those documents as soon as we can get them.
Thank you. As Mr. Hart also responds to that same question, would you be able to tell us if you plan to share the draft of the text in the interim? Mr. Hart?
Yes, thank you, Chairwoman. I would say that in terms of USAID engagement within this process, we really have been focused on Article 10 in terms of looking at humanitarian assistance and that specific aspect of this. And so I think Ms. Buckledge is truly positioned much better to answer the timeline question.
So in terms of drafts, they are continuing to go back and forth between the 2 countries. And so as it's an ongoing negotiation process, we wouldn't normally make drafts of that nature public. However, I know Special Envoy Yun is eager to engage Congress, and so at any time, if you
So
would
maybe
like...
perhaps we can do some sort of briefings in the interim?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Thank you. We'll take you up on that. And also, what are the remaining irritants in the negotiations? Are there any major issues that remain outstanding that might delay that final agreement? For example, I'm aware that nuclear cleanup assistance in the Marshall Islands and also the economic assistance to freely associated states are still a significant issue in that negotiation process.
Thank you. In terms of significant irritants, each country is different, and you've cited 2 particular issues. We have the goal of the memorandums of understanding was to agree on our top line numbers with each country and to understand what their needs were in terms of economic assistance and to be responsive to those. As we have those memorandums of understanding signed, we're now very much focused on the technical aspects of the agreement language, and so we don't expect any major irritants to upset those discussions. But they do include fiscal procedures, auditing procedures, accountability for funds, grant procedures, and so forth that are quite technical and take some time to work out. There is also the federal programs and services agreements, which involve multiple agencies across the United States government, including our USAID colleagues on the disaster assistance side.
Thank you. The president of FSM recently published that letter. I mentioned that in my opening statement, detailing Beijing's efforts to influence and bully micronation leaders. So how do the COFAs serve as a tool to counter PRC malign influence in the Pacific?
Well, the compacts are really the underpinnings of our relationship with these 3 countries. As you well know, we have our longstanding historical relationships But absent the new economic assistance provisions, we really leave the three countries open to predatory behavior, coercive behavior. And we are well aware of President Penuelo's letter. We've read it in detail, and it does lay out a disturbing pattern that we are quite concerned by and that we see across the Pacific, not just in the three countries. The compacts aim to support the governments, good governance, economic development, social cohesion, as well as health, education across the full spectrum, as well as the climate and environmental challenges that you've also mentioned, so that we don't leave our partners open to this type of influence.
Thank you. My time's up, so I will now recognize Ranking Member Bera for your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And thank you, Mr. Nakoa, for, again, reminding us that we are a Pacific Island nation, because my good friend, Congressman Case from Hawaii, would get mad at me if I didn't constantly remember that. And we should all remember that, and the long history that we share with the Pacific Island nations. Let me ask a first question to Mr. Hart. You talked about aid and development priorities and some of the partnership with our like-valued allies, New Zealand, Australia, the French, that have longstanding relations there. Could you highlight some of those areas of partnership, some of the areas of focus that we should prioritize, and obviously climate change being one that's an esoteric threat?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. And I think that, one, we recognize that we have to be working together with partners, other donors, but also regional partners in terms of the Pacific community, for example, and making sure that we're really looking at the entire structure of the Pacific and utilizing those organizations that are well developed there. And so as we look at some of the economic growth aspects, because indeed, COVID has really hit the islands hard in terms of economic growth, we need to be pursuing at multiple levels the efforts in terms of the Palau Cable Spur and looking at the East Micronesia cable as well. Those are inroads for communications, which very much relate to health issues, very much relate to economic growth aspects, very much are driving and have the potential to drive workforce and jobs as well. And so as we look at those types of foundational types of investments, that is exactly where we're reaching out to our partners to making sure that we are coming together to provide a very solid, secure option for communication. And so as per my examples earlier, I think the other aspect that we're looking at is in terms of humanitarian assistance and working with our Australian and New Zealand counterparts in particular, looking at France's engagement in that as well, and how we can go about utilizing some of the coordination mechanisms that exist to further expand that. Those are some examples.
Fantastic. In the last Congress, when the administration hosted the Pacific Island Summit here, you had leaders from all the Pacific Island nations as well as the ambassadors, and we had a chance to sit in a round table and interact. And when I mentioned ways that I think we could use some of the technologies that we have and address some of the issues, and I talked about desalination and providing fresh water, and I think we look at the islands sometimes and think they're surrounded by water, but could any of you talk about the impact of, we know how to do desalination fairly well, and the impact of providing something like that to the island, something that's just a basic necessity.
Absolutely, if I could, sir. So one of the other areas that we have is, and we're very much promoting, is the fact that we need to listen to local voices, local solution sets. And so our Pacific American Fund is an opportunity to be able to provide some grants, significant grants to local solutions and local problems. And salinization of water is a great example of exactly that. The existential threat that when you do not have water is very evident very, very rapidly, in addition to other climate resilience types of activities. In addition to natural disasters, of which I mentioned a couple already. And so I think the islands, what I have seen and heard from them is that, one, listen to our local voices, which I think is why it's so important to get our presence there beefed up and increasingly engaged with the islands. Two, when it comes to local solution sets, we need to have access to those funds that are referenced in terms of the climate financing solution sets. And so one of the things that we have done is work with local entities to be able to access directly from those climate, a variety of GEF and other types of climate financing opportunities to link it to the real problem on the ground and make sure that those funds are flowing.
Great. And maybe in just the last few seconds to the Coast Guard or to Interior, on the fisheries question, obviously, it does seem like there's a lot of illegal fishing that's taking place in these regions. Can you touch on that and touch on the impact that that's having?
Thank you, sir. We actually do see quite a bit of illegal fishing in the region. We work very closely with the Pacific Island Fisheries Forum, and we have agreements with many of the member states there that allows us to work and help identify where there's illegal fishing. We also have bilateral agreements with individual states that allow us to have them board our vessels, and we can jointly do some law enforcement operations to stop the fishing.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Regner for any questions you may have.
I thank you, Chairwoman Kim, and I want to thank our witnesses for their service and their time. I'd ask them to pull the microphones close to their face and speak clearly into them. We're having a little difficulty hearing. Increasingly, the Pacific Islands are on the front lines of Sino-U.S. rivalry as China attempts to erode support for Taiwan and push the borders of its sphere of influence out to the so-called second island chain, a line that passes through Marshall Islands, Guam, and Palau. China does not share our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. It seeks to intimidate, to entrap, and coerce these countries into increasing China's prestige and furthering its agenda. As co-chair of the Pacific Island Caucus, I am proud to support the special relationship the United States shares with the Marshall Islands and Micronesia and Palau. The United States must continue to stand together with the freely associated states in defense of our common interests. China is seeking to build military dual-use infrastructure throughout the Pacific Island region, such as piers that can accommodate Chinese Navy ships. Ms. Haverstick, what is the status of Chinese infrastructure investment in the region, particularly the dual-use infrastructure, and what are the implications for U.S. interests?
Thank you, ma'am. I can say that we have seen, our cutters have witnessed and seen that there is some infrastructure being built up. However, we have not necessarily seen that it has been influencing our ability to work with the partner nations.
Mr. Hart?
Thank you, ma'am. So when I was in the Solomon Islands this past year, I saw some of the infrastructure that was being presented. And we met also with the civil society and the press, who were able to bring forth a light to shine on the practices that were happening, both in terms of the infrastructure, but also in terms of the IUU fishing and the forestry and some of the deals that were under the table. And we heard about those deals under the table from civil society who are there, and we are supporting to bring these issues to light and to truly present the other side of the story.
Thank you. Australia and New Zealand have been valuable partners in the Pacific Island region, helping the United States maintain strong relations with small, remote countries scattered across a massive geographic area. Ms. Buckledge, how can the U.S. cooperate more closely with Australia and New Zealand to deepen engagement across the region, and what other nations should the U.S. be working with?
We have continued to engage with Australia and New Zealand and have stepped up our game with them, particularly in relating to the compact countries. They have showed renewed interest in engaging with the Marshall Islands, Palau, and the Federated States of Micronesia. And so we're working closely with them to ensure that our assistance that we're providing under the compact and will provide going forward is complementary, and we're not stepping on each other's toes, that it is very much a cooperative effort. In terms of other countries that are engaged in the region, Taiwan is also stepping up across the Compact of Free Association countries, as well as Japan, South Korea. The EU and Germany have also showed renewed interest, as well as the UK. So we have quite a number of allies and partners who are in the game with us and very interested in building these relationships. Thank you.
Compacts of free association between the United States and the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau set out the terms of our unique relationship with these states. The agreements prevent our adversaries from exploiting a huge swath of the Pacific Ocean and guarantee the United States a foothold from which to protect its interests. Mr. Hart, to what degree does China seek to undermine relations between the U.S. and freely associated states, and do PRC influence operations in the Pacific Island region threaten renegotiations of the compacts?
While I would leave the compact negotiations aspect to my state colleague, I think in terms of what I have seen and what I have heard from our Pacific neighbors is that they need us there. They need our presence. They need us to be able to engage on the issues that are affecting them most. And those are the issues that I've outlined in terms of some of the climate, some of the economic growth, the basic issues that they are dealing with in this time where they really need us to be able to engage. That's where we're focused.
I think my time's expired. I'll let Ms. Bachlish perhaps respond in writing, and I will yield back to the chairwoman. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. I now recognize Representative Radewagan for her questions.
Talofa. Thank you, Chairwoman Kim and Ranking Member Bera. I too wish to welcome the panel. Thank you for being here today. I am for both sound ocean resource conservation and national security. But yesterday, President Biden proposed eliminating U.S. and American Samoan fishing grounds larger than Alaska and Colorado combined, according to the president. Well, I think he took some bad advice on this ocean conservation proposal that may hand PRC a win in the Pacific. By initiating this National Marine Sanctuary designation process without consultation or requiring mitigation of expected economic hardship on American Samoa's cannery workers, small businesses, and family enterprises, the president treated our territory less favorably than PRC treats Pacific islands that are aligned with Beijing or that are at risk of surrendering to PRC domination. Our compact partner nations, whose security and well-being we are here to consider today, must wonder if the U.S. is prepared to outcompete PRC. And with the chairwoman's permission, I will submit for the record my letter to the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Interior, opposing the new administration's marine sanctuary proposal unless and until its potential adverse impact on American Samoa is addressed and some allowance for fishing is made.
Without
This-
objection. So ordered.
Ms. Haverstedt, I've got a question for you. In August 2022, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Oliver Henry was on an illegal fisheries patrol and could not obtain entry to refuel in the Solomon Islands. Then all the U.S. naval ships were blocked from the Solomon Islands, except for the hospital ship USNS Mercy. On January 26, 2023, Vanuatu failed to issue timely clearance for U.S. Coast Guard cutter Juniper to enter Port Vila to commence a planned ship-rider illegal fishing operations patrol. Has it or the U.S. State Department lodged any complaints with the Solomons or Vanuatu governments for impeding illegal fisheries patrols?
Thank you, Madam. No, as far as I know, the State Department did not lodge any complaints. I do understand it was a clerical error on the case of the Solomon Islands.
Well, I've long advocated, Ms. Haverstick, for additional Coast Guard presence in the Pacific Islands region. Can you briefly go over what additional resources you need in the Pacific to meet the mission set that has been assigned to you and to counter the PRC in the region?
Yes, we have in FY23 budget, we do have an Indo-Pacific support cutter, the Harriet Lane, which will be relocating from the Atlantic side over to Pacific. So that will be a cutter that can go around all of the different islands and provide some support for our partners. In addition, FY23 also allows for some additional national security cutter presence in the region. We have TACLETs and, tactical law enforcement detachments that also have increased, and additional mobile training teams to help with a partnership in the region. In FY24 budget, that will sustain our current activity. However, if we have some unfunded priority requests for additional fast response cutters, if that were funded, that would provide us some additional capability to increase.
Well, I'm out of time, but I also have a question for Secretary Nakua as well as Ms. Bockledge, but I will submit that for the record. Thank you.
Thank
Chairwoman
you.
Kim.
I now
I yield
recognize Representative Barr for questions you may have.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for holding this hearing. This is a region of tremendous strategic importance to the United States and obviously to the island nations that are part of the freely associated states. My first question is about DFC. Since the compacts of free association were last negotiated 20 years ago, the tools for U.S. foreign policy have changed, particularly OPIC and the USAID Development Credit Authority were combined to create obviously the Development Finance Corporation, DFC. We've heard that the products DFC offers are sometimes difficult for projects in the Pacific Islands to take advantage of, since they are in communities with small populations and economies. Ms. Blockledge or Mr. Hart, is State looking at the unique tools DFC offers when crafting these new negotiations? And what steps are you all taking to ensure that the COFA countries are aware of all these tools available with DFC in addition to USAID?
Thank you for the question, sir.
And by the way, go Big Blue. I know you've got a connection to the University of Kentucky.
Whoop. Okay.
Early exit in the tournament, though.
Thank you. So with the DFC and USAID, since some of the DFC's tools are our previous tools, we are very much collaborating with them very closely across the board. I think what you're pointing out is an excellent point when it comes to economies of scale. And that's why I mentioned the Pacific community. We have to be able to work with regional organizations so that we get some of those more economies of scale going and have those types of investment potentials that is not just on a country-by-country basis, but looking at the larger market. And so I think that's one of the areas where we have reached into SPCs, or the Pacific Communities talents, to be able to say, help us break down some of these barriers between the real needs on the ground when it comes to climate financing or others. Working with DFC very much so on a couple of projects right now in the pipeline, where we are actively trying to work with DFC to identify upstream what are the potentials, sifting through those potential projects and providing DFC with some of the best potentials they can possibly have on their radar. So we are working very closely with the DFC because private sector has to be part of the solution set.
Well, as I have spoken with Scott Nathan about this, I think the private capital potential in the island nations is with DFC is very important as we counter Belt and Road. Let me ask Ms. Blockledge a question, and you can comment on DFC as well if you want. In the FY23 NDAA passed last year, we included my legislation, the Pacific Islands Embassies Act, that establishes physical U.S. embassies on the Pacific Island nations of the Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Tonga, and authorize expanded physical presence on Vanuatu to reinforce American leadership in the Pacific region. Can you provide an update as to the status of these embassies? What has been the reception from these countries to seeing increased U.S. presence on their island? And I note in particular the Solomon Islands, where the Chinese are really making an aggressive push.
So I can provide an overall update in that the process for all of these is moving forward. Unfortunately, my role at the State Department is focused on the 3 compact countries, and so I don't have the details of where each one of those resides. If you would, I'd like to take that back as a question for the record and provide you a fulsome answer.
Thank you. We're excited about the prospect of having additional U.S. diplomatic presence in the region, and we know how important it is. So please encourage State Department to move that process forward as quickly as possible. And finally, with China's building on reefs in the South China Sea and agreements like its pact with the Solomon Islands, some believe that China's strategy in the Pacific is to mimic Japan's island strategy during World War II. Can any of you go into detail about how Belt and Road investments by China in the Pacific Islands, Oceania, can turn economic relationships into security relationships that may eventually pose a threat to United States naval access to the region? Any of you care to comment?
I can comment with relation to the compact countries I can comment in relation to the compact countries in that the compacts do give us full defense authority and responsibility in those countries and provide our ability to strategically deny third country military access. However, as you have noted, China's ability to convert economic to military is something that we're watching very closely and very concerned about. One of the main reasons why we do not want to open up, we want to get this economic assistance passed as expeditiously as possible so that we don't leave those countries open to predatory economic practices by the Chinese in the region.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, with your indulgence, one final question. I had a very productive and nice meeting with the ambassador from the Marshall Islands last week, and he brought up the legacy nuclear fallout issue. Can you address how those negotiations are going?
Certainly, we have heard from the Marshall Islands, and we understand how important these issues are to the Marshall Islands. We certainly have not forgotten the legacy of the U.S. testing program. The United States is concerned about addressing the RMI's public health, environment, and other needs that they have identified, regardless of cause, nuclear or otherwise. And so we are working closely with the RMI government and for the economic assistance package to help them address the needs of the entire country of the Marshall Islands.
Thank you. I sense that's an important issue for our friends in the Marshall Islands. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Sherman for any questions he may have.
Thank you. We are beginning to see the passing of the last remaining veterans of the Pacific in World War II. We have fought for these strategic islands before. Now we are fighting again, hopefully in a non-lethal battle, and we need to pay attention. And this battle will be far less expensive than other battles if we handle it at the aid and diplomacy level. It's good to be here with Ed Case, our fearless leader on the Pacific Islands Caucus. I think we've got an awful lot of members of that caucus here at this hearing. I want to address, particularly with Ms. Blockage, one of the most extraordinary letters I've ever seen signed by a head of state, signed by David Panulo of the Federated States of Micronesia. Without objection, I'd like to see this entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
This is a 13-page letter, and I've never seen, this letter needs not just to go to, I know you focus on the Pacific Islands, this needs to go to every head of state worldwide so that they know what they're up against. I'll just quote a few parts. We are aware of PRC activity in our exclusive economic zone, where they are looking for territory for submarine travel paths. When we sent our own patrol boats to our own economic exclusive zone to check on the PRC research vessel, the PRC sent a warning for us to stay out of our own zone, to stay away from them in their own economic zone. Goes on to say that the Chinese ambassador suggested that a foreign minister or ambassador sign a memorandum of understanding and not tell the president of the country. Talk about actively attempting to interfere in a country's governance. He talks about how in a visit to Fiji, he was followed by a People's Liberation Army officer, and concludes, I have had direct threats against my personal safety from PRC officials acting in an official capacity. This is not what we accept as diplomacy. This is an extraordinary letter. It is surprising to me that it has not gotten more coverage. Not because, I understand, unfortunately, that the Pacific Islands don't get the coverage that they deserve, but China gets a lot of coverage. And the letter also says, what do you call it when an elected official is given an envelope filled with money after a meal at the PRC embassy or after an inauguration? What else do you call it when a senior official is discreetly given a smartphone after visiting Beijing? What else do you call it when a senior official explicitly asks Chinese diplomats for televisions and other gifts? Bribery, intimidation, and what I think might be a Pacific Island term, a chutzpah, of telling Micronesia to not patrol its own economic zone. I'll ask our State Department representative, what's been the reaction to this letter in the Pacific Islands, not only in Micronesia, but the related countries?
So I'm not sure I can speak to the reaction amongst all of the countries in the Pacific Islands, but I will say that we are very much aware of the letter and have and are disturbed by the pattern that it lays out of Chinese behavior. The PRC's involvement in the region has grown, and we've seen an increase.
I think this is of interest to citizens in Africa who see their countries making deals with China and should know what their tactics are. Are we on track to complete the Compacts of Free Association by May, which is your target date?
Yes, we are. We are trying very, very hard to get all of those agreements done and complete so that we can get a full package of draft implementing legislation to Congress in time.
Okay, and we've got 6 desk officers at State exclusively focused on the Pacific Islands, 1 at USAID. We're talking about 14 countries. Are we understaffed?
Sorry. As we've been focused, our team is focused on the compact negotiations exclusively. I can't speak to the staffing per se, but I would very much like to get a complete answer back to you. I know that the Secretary has recently
I look forward to an answer
asked
for the record. I've
increased
exceeded my time. I
resources.
yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Davidson for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today and for your work to make the Pacific region more stable and, frankly, more hospitable for U.S.-Asian relations. My colleagues, virtually everyone who's spoken before me has highlighted the challenges and frustrations with China and kind of the growing influence of China, and not in a way where, you could be happy for them, where it's like, yeah, I'm glad your economy's doing better, things are going well, you're growing your middle class, that's all good, but in a way that's exploitive of other countries and, frankly, of the deals that they already made. They made commitments when going back to the Clinton administration, to be part of the World Trade Organization, they said that they would be a market economy. Ms. Buckledge, is China a market economy?
Again, unfortunately, my role at the State Department is to be focused on the compact and the compact negotiations.
Yeah, I understand. People are directing a lot of questions to you because the State Department didn't send the other person who would actually be directly responsible for answering these questions.
I understand.
Does anyone think China's a market economy? No one does, because they're not. They're a command economy. They committed to do that. They are violating all kinds of principles. They're exploiting the loophole to say they're still a developing economy. They're the world's second largest economy. And they're stealing intellectual property with a whole government approach to the theft. They're blocking market access, and they're exploiting access in other countries. They're not just doing this to the United States, but it's been particularly harmful to the people of my home state of Ohio. It's been very bad for manufacturing in particular around the world. And if there's one bright spot out of COVID, the planet, frankly, has woken up to the supply chain risk that we have and the vulnerability we have in China on so many issues. One of the ways that China's worked to isolate other countries, including ASEAN countries, is by keeping them dependent upon China for goods and services. Ms. Buckledge, you can surely comment on this. What's the state of the RCEP and the ASEAN countries?
The state of the PRC in the ASEAN countries in terms of their economic.
With the RCEP agreement, to basically, in the absence of U.S. doing Trans-Pacific Partnership, a lot of other countries signed specific trade agreements with China, and they're growing their trade relations with China. And frankly, within the ASEAN countries, there's some concern that some of the countries are trying to play it both ways. Meanwhile, just today, just before this hearing, we voted on the floor to treat the ASEAN as an international organization, all kinds of privileges and immunities. We got nothing in exchange for it. I would have loved to have voted for it, but I couldn't because I don't feel like we've successfully dealt with China's influence in the compact. So could you address that?
So I can't address that here today, but I would take that question back for the record for you.
Would anyone else like to take a stab at it?
Sir, if I could just comment, in terms of the connectivity aspect that the Pacific Islands are looking for, in terms of the Palau cable spur, in terms of the East Micronesia cable, those are the inroads to be able to provide more economic growth potential, more education, health services, et cetera. And so those are some of the areas that we are focused on in the Pacific when it comes to addressing most directly the challenge that the PRC puts forth, ensuring that those cables are actually secure and reliable.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, we care a lot about the shipping routes as well. But there are 4 Pacific Island countries that have established diplomatic relationships with Taiwan. The PRC is placing extensive pressure on these nations to switch their diplomatic allegiance. How's the United States countering those coercion efforts by China?
So for the 3 compact countries, 2 of those are countries that recognize Taiwan, and the United States is actively engaged in the compact negotiations, not only, but for one of the reasons is to support these countries, and we recognize their sovereignty. We recognize all 3 countries' sovereign right to make their own decisions for their people and to have relationships with Taiwan and to push back on China when China puts pressure on them. In one specific case, Palau has been a direct recipient, I suppose, of this Chinese pressure to switch its allegiance and suffered economically for it. And one of the reasons that we want to have a compact agreement with Palau in FY24 in time for FY24 instead of waiting until their current agreement expires is to support their economic stability and their ability to recover from both COVID and the economic shocks that the Chinese.
Thanks for the clarification. My time's expired, and I yield.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Case for any questions he may have.
Thank you so much, Chair, and I appreciate the subcommittee's allowing me to join you here today. It's a very critical hearing on a very critical region, and I appreciate your various comments on our Pacific Islands Caucus, which is now 29 members strong, completely bipartisan. In fact, the membership of this subcommittee is largely the membership of that caucus, including 5 of the 6 co-chairs. I just happen to be the other one. I wanted to, a couple of comments to each of you. To Ms. Haverstick, great job in the Pacific on the Coast Guard. Question is, and I'm not going to ask the question, it's a rhetorical question, how to expand. I think you're the only, my recollection is you're the only U.S. institution that actually operates in every one of these jurisdictions. I liked your characterization of you occupying a space between the state's diplomacy and defense and security. And I think that is where you operate, and that's where people are comfortable with you operating. Would make the comment that while you're busy sending your cutters out into the Pacific, it does stretch things back home, in my case, Hawaii and Guam and other places. And so the redeployment of the Harriet Lane is really, really critical to that. You're a little mismatched in terms of the cutters you're sending, because you're sending your smaller cutters right out on long deployments. So that presents some issues. So that's something we need to work on. Mr. Hart, USAID, I think great that you're expanding as part of, you know, in my view, never should have gotten down to that low level of capacity, you know, 1 or 2 people in Fiji as an example. But rapid ramp up. I was in Fiji at the end of last year meeting with your folks and others, and I think for you the question is, do you adequately resource for the capacity it's going to take to ramp up to your you know, your ambitions, both your own USAID people as well as the local capacity to implement your programs, because you're going to, well, I forget what the figure was, but you're going from 0 to 60 million or something like that inside of 18 months or maybe lower than that. And so, you know, I think we all need to just be working on, well, how do we actually pull that off? Because I think you would all agree that as we look at the Pacific Islands and re-engaging across the board with the Pacific Islands, they're looking at us saying, are you guys in this for real, for the long term this time around? So for me, the next 1 year to 2 years is really, really critical for us to all follow through from a budget perspective, from a coordination perspective, from an implementation perspective, because we're being watched to see whether this is a real re-engagement or not. Mr. Nakoa, thank you so much for the work on the compacts. That's great news that they're coming along. Assistant Secretary Cantor, 2 days ago, addressed a letter to us through the Natural Resources Committee that basically, as part of the compacts, endorsed from Interior's perspective, the Compact Impact Fairness Act. And you made reference to this in your testimony, that there are many jurisdictions, of which Hawaii is only one of them, that have borne hundreds of millions of dollars of impacts from the Compact residents over the last duration of the compacts, and that's just not acceptable anymore. And so as the administration sends this to you, Ms. Buckledge, as the administration sends the compacts to us, I want to support them, but I can't do it again on a blind basis where the impacts are not taken care of this time around, because, you know, $30 million a year spread throughout 5 or so jurisdictions or more, plus a little bit more that Congress adds on, as against hundreds of millions of dollars of actual impacts to the jurisdictions, is fundamentally unfair. And this is not a state initiative. This is a federal government initiative for all kinds of purposes, defense purposes, social development purposes, historical relationship purposes, and we should do this. But I think the direct question to you is, will state also endorse that bill when you send the compacts over to us?
So I think the State Department very much recognizes the compact impact and is in support. We do think that more comprehensive legislation to address the impacts of the freely associated state citizens that are living in the United States is the way to provide relief.
Okay, that wasn't exactly an answer. So you can take it back. But
Well,
the
we-
direct request is that the federal administration, not just the Interior Department, but state, because you're going to be running this now, right?
Yes.
You're basically taking over much of the administration, both administration as well as budgetary authority, if I understand the president's budget properly.
So the president's budget request is that the funding will come to state, but will be implemented by the Department of Interior so that we can take full advantage of the expertise that Interior has developed
Okay.
over the last 20 years. But yes, I will get you a formal answer back. We received a copy of the letter this morning, so we haven't had a chance to digest it fully, but we will get you a formal response
Thank
back.
you. And thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all the witnesses for your valuable testimony today and the members for participating and asking questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses to respond. So with that, I would like to ask you to respond those in writing. And the chair now recognizes Ranking Member Bera for any closing remarks that you may have.
Thank you. I'll keep it brief. I do want to thank the witnesses and everyone within the administration for working to get these agreements in place. Obviously, we all, in a bipartisan way, understand the importance of cementing this relationship, sending a strong signal to our brothers and sisters in the islands about a long-term U.S. commitment with our friends and allies. So thank you again. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. And pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, and subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the committee now stands adjourned. Thank you very much.